talking to the camera and you're so
Hi everyone.
sleepy.
Okay, this morning we're going to be talking about a very, very important component of the debate, and that's the reply speech. Before we even start on this, I want to stress, I know the reply speech is half of a regular speech. It doesn't mean that it's half as important. And in some cases, especially in close debates, the reply speech is critical to you winning or losing a debate. I mean, I have seen debates lost because the person didn't take the reply speech seriously. Didn't deal with a lot of the key issues, didn't reaffirm things for the judge, or just basically contradicted a lot of things that happened during the debate. And so made the judge doubt exactly what was happening. And even if the judge had meant to give it to a particular team, some judges change their minds when they hear the things that are said in the reply speech. Now, judges have different perspectives regarding the speech and how important it is. Some judges think, well, look, it's only half of a regular speech, so no matter what, I should already have made up my mind by the third speaker. So the reply speech doesn't really do anything because it's only half. Personally, I disagree with that in the sense that, yes, I agree. If it's a close win, then the reply speech is very, very important. If it's a clear win or a thrash win, where basically you shouldn't even have gotten out of bed, you know, or even your mother wouldn't like your speech, you know, that kind of thing. Yeah, a reply speech isn't going to do anything, but many debates are close debates. And even clear wins or losses can be mitigated by a reply speech, meaning instead of losing by a clear margin, and that could affect you in the rankings later on, you can lose by a close margin, which is good. Or instead of winning by a clear margin, because you screwed up the reply speech, you win by a close margin instead. And some tournaments, when they decide to break, they decide it in terms of margin points, like how many points separated you from the teams that you face, plus, minus, whatever. So differentials will count, or speaker points, which also count. So even if it is half of a speech, and while the reply speech doesn't give you speaker awards, the reply speech still counts in terms of your total team score. So even if you won, okay, I've seen this happen all too often. Teams relax in the reply speech because they think they've won clearly, when they could have earned an extra point or two if they just took things seriously. And that extra point or two can be the difference between breaking or not breaking. There was one international tournament I didn't break in, I think it was at Australs, by a .33 margin. In other words, 1 point from one judge in the entire debate. Okay? The other team, the team that broke, had 1 point more for one debate from one judge, and we didn't. So would a reply speech have helped? Yeah, it would have. Okay? Could I have had maybe the opportunity to break and do great things in that tournament, maybe even win the tournament? Perhaps, but I would never know because it didn't happen. So, having established that and how important the reply speech is, let's talk about what the reply speech really means. What are you supposed to be doing in a reply speech? And I've written on the board a sort of a visual representation of a reply speech. Now this isn't meant to be absolutely prescriptive, meaning you don't have to follow this in every instance. This is just a sample of how things can be done, and I'm going to explain how this sample works. And while I explain this, I'll contrast this with the third speech. Because the third speech, people always ask this, what's the difference between a third speech and a reply speech? It sounds like we're doing the same things. You know, we rebut, we talk about focus, we give a central issue, there's like points of view and stuff. So what's the difference? Is it just half of a third speech? Should we just continue a third speech then in the reply speech? Or whatever my third speaker didn't deal with, I'll deal with in my reply speech? Or is there something entirely different? A reply speech is something entirely different. So let's talk about the reply speech. What exactly is a reply speech? In the rules of Wordl Schools, the reply speech is meant to be something like a biased adjudication, okay, of what the debate is all about. Oh, what happened in the debate, pardon me, okay? What is a biased adjudication mean? It's almost like you pretend. Yeah, yes, Ryan.
You said what is it?
Yeah, what is it?
It's just like a summary of the debate, but it's only covering the. It's making it seem like one side is clearly.
That's good. That's exactly what's happening. You're pretending to be a judge who's already made up his or her mind. You say, okay, the team that won this debate is team proposition. The fact that you're in proposition is, you know, a minor equivalent. But team proposition clearly won this debate because they were more focused, they were clearly more substantial, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's an oral adjudication. What Varyn said is basically you copy that and pretend you are a judge, but now you are from a particular team. So you are meant to be biased. Let me stress that first of all. You're meant to be biased. You're meant to look at things from your perspective. You're meant to show people that your side won. But, and you know, from the school of fairness and whatever, I really don't like it when people misrepresent things that happen in the debate. Okay, I want to stress that. Just because you're biased doesn't mean you lie. Okay? You can't say, oh, they never said that. They never gave a single example. They gave 12. They never explained how this thing, they did it for 3 minutes. They never showed us the clashes. They focused on 3 clashes in the previous speech. I mean, you can't do that in a reply speech. You just sound like a stupid adjudicator. Right? If an adjudicator gave that kind of oral adjudication, you would protest. You would go, dude never read anything, never wrote anything down, didn't listen to my speech. I don't know what debate he was watching, but it wasn't our debate. So when an adjudicator gives an oral adjudication, that oral adjudication is based on the facts of the debate. It's based on what actually transpired. So don't misrepresent. Don't say this team said this when they really didn't say it. Don't say they meant this when they didn't really mean it. So point out what actually happened in the debate, but point it out in a slightly biased way. Okay? Do you understand how that thing works? So for example, if they did give 12 examples, you can say, look, they gave 12 examples, but they never linked those examples to the motion at hand, okay, which might have actually happened. So while they said many things that sounded very factual, they didn't actually prove anything. Okay? That's an example of explaining what happened, showing it on the factual level, but then still making it seem like your side won the debate. So that's generally what you do in a reply speech. And there are different viewpoints regarding this. Some people are like really traditional, really serious about it. They actually pretend to be judges. They literally come up and say, and they did this and this was wrong, and we did this and this was right, and that's cool. Other people have a different view. Some people say, you know, reply speech, I'm going to do anything that's convincing. I mean, if I want to tell a story, if I want to rap, if I want to do interpretative dance, but the judges buy that and they think it's really, really good and it's going to help me win the debate, then that's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to tell you which one is right, which one is wrong. I will say, however, that as long as it's within the rules, as long as you're fair, okay, and as long as you deal with the major clashes and issues in the debate, then yeah, and pretty much do your own thing. Okay, come up with your own style. You can be as original as you'd like to be, as long as it's effective, and as long as it's within the bounds of the rules, and as long as you're fair and you're not misrepresenting the other side or your own case. Because some reply speakers do that too. Oh, we gave you 52 different examples. They gave 3. We were clearly doing this. My first speaker spent minutes talking about this and establishing that, and he mentioned that clearly in his definition. He never did. You know, those kinds of things. Reply speakers tend to try to warp the perspectives of the audience. So they go beyond the bounds of bias to actual outright, you know, lies. And I don't like that, personally. Okay? So let's now look at a sample visual representation of what a reply speech is. And as I do this, I'm going to contrast this with a third speaker speech. Okay? The first thing that, in this particular sample, the reply speaker is going to do is establish what the central issue of the debate really is. Because a reply speaker is generally painting a picture. You're trying to tell people, you know, you're giving people a snapshot of what happened in the debate. It's like, if I saw all these different speeches, then what came out most? What was the most critical thing? What is the thing that stood out from everything that was said? Okay, and why, because of this particular thing, do we win this debate? Somebody give me a motion. Any motion. And I'll give you a sample. Any motion. This house would? This house supports diplomatic immunity. Okay, this is a Korean national championship motion. Okay, well, what's the central issue there then? Okay, it depends on your perspective, because even when you mention the central issue, you're still, remember, it's biased, right? You're still doing it in such a way so it favors your side. So for instance, if you're on the proposition side, this house supports diplomatic immunity, you're supposed to be looking at an issue that favors diplomatic immunity. Okay? So everybody knows what diplomatic immunity is, right? Okay, so for instance, central issue in proposition side could be something like this. ladies and gentlemen, the key question in this debate is, should we jeopardize decades of international cooperation and diplomacy just because we feel some people should be punished for some crimes? Okay. Should we jeopardize international relations as a whole? Okay. Just because someone breaks a traffic law or does something that you disagree with? Or is there a better way? Okay, something like that. So you're focusing on what you think is more important, which is the international diplomacy, the international relations aspect, etc., etc. Okay? And later on, when you focus on the points of view, which is what you have to do next, you tell, we in the proposition side think that international relations and diplomacy is much more important. And if individual people break certain laws, there are other remedies for that. You can still find a way to punish them, or you can still find a way to make sure that that never happens again without having to remove the diplomatic immunity. Of course, the opposition tells you otherwise. They say, well, just because some people might have committed some crimes, all diplomats must now not have diplomatic immunity. They must not have that protection and that courtesy, which has helped a lot of tense issues become much calmer. For instance, in many instances in the past, it would have been criminal, okay, for certain people to do certain things. And yet, it was necessary for them to do that in the case of diplomacy. For instance, how can the United States still relate with Cuba? How can Fidel Castro be invited to speak before the United Nations without diplomatic immunity? I mean, the United States at one point even tried to assassinate him. How can he be convinced that he would be safe without diplomatic immunity? How can someone like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad of Iran go to the United Nations and plead for his case without this kind of diplomatic immunity? If he fears arrest or if he fears persecution, how can you establish these kinds of important ties? Even the Camp David talks. Okay? If you have people like Yasser Arafat, for example, who was the head of the PLO and at that time considered a terrorist, how could he have come to the United States after a certain point of time without that level of diplomatic immunity? Because maybe for his past crimes, etc. I mean, there's so many important things. So you explain this, okay? You show how your point of view is much better than the point of view of the opposition side. Yes, we concede some people have done bad things. Yes, we concede they have done horrible things. But there are other ways of dealing with these people. You can expel them as diplomats. The home country can rescind their diplomatic immunity unilaterally. They can say, we no longer recognize him as a diplomat, go ahead and punish him any way you want. There's so many ways to do this without having to punish everyone in the world. So that's an example, okay? And then now that you have shown the comparison in terms of the point of view, and shown that your point of view is superior to the point of view of the opposition in this case, you then talk about the key points that happen in the debate. And when I say point, I mean two possible things. I mean an argument or an issue, that's one. Or I mean a specific event that happened in the debate. Okay, what do I mean? So let me give you some examples. If there was a problem with the definition, and there was a definitional challenge, for instance, that's a key point. That's something you probably have to deal with first. You might have to talk about, look, before we even go on and talk about the clashes in this debate, let's analyze the definition. Because we gave a good definition and the opposition said otherwise. So was our definition really good? Something like that. And you have to reestablish your definition if there's a definitional challenge. Or, like I said, you can talk about arguments. Let's say, the key argument in this debate for the proposition side is the idea of international relationships and protecting the ability of nations to speak to each other without fear of persecution and reprisal. That's the most critical issue from our side. That's the big thing that we proved in this debate, and they never once dealt with this issue all throughout their 3 speeches. That's an example. Okay? So you talk about the issues. Obviously, the points that you bring up are going to be points that are biased for your side. If there was a point you totally dropped, if there was a point where you were a little weak, or if your second speaker promised to tackle 2 things and didn't really establish the second thing, are you going to emphasize that in your reply speech?
No.
Okay. Now look, I know my second speaker was an idiot, and I know he didn't really explain it, and I told him to do that, but this is what he did, and this is why we still win, even though he did that and it was a bad thing. You never say that in a reply speech. because you're just emphasizing your weaknesses. You know, instead, you emphasize your strengths, right? Now, in doing so, as you go to each point, you still have to do a comparison. You have to provide a comparison between what you did and what the opposition did, right? So, if you say, one of the key points might be the significant argument from the opposition. Now, the only thing the opposition said that they tried to carry all the way through was that some people commit crimes and diplomatic immunity prevents prosecution for these particular crimes. And they think that's wrong. They talk about justice, fairness, and all these other things. That was a key clash in this debate, ladies and gentlemen. But let's analyze what actually happened and how we dealt with this in proposition. We talked to you about alternatives. Okay? We said it is possible to punish these people without giving up diplomatic immunity across the board. It is possible to find ways, not just on the unilateral level from their home government, but even in your own case, like what England has done recently with Russia, with some diplomats from Russia. They expelled 4 diplomats recently, okay, because they suspected involvement or interference in the case of a Russian expat being poisoned in the UK, okay? Something like that. They did that without having to remove diplomatic immunity for all Russian diplomats, which would have caused a huge international crisis, okay? Because while there is a straining of tensions between Russia and the United Kingdom right now, the fact that there are still diplomats that can talk to each other helps ease those tensions. And that's what we're saying. So while we can punish under our model, okay, our model protects all of the established relationships. It protects the other diplomats that might otherwise be persecuted. If you didn't have diplomatic immunity, would you agree to be posted in Iran? Would you agree to be going to North Korea? Okay? I mean, that's a very good example in the end. You know, you say North Korea, South Korea. They've actually had diplomatic talks with each other. And they've had immunity. Okay? So neither could punish the other, even though they're technically still at war with each other. Now imagine that. The only way they can do this is if you have a concept like diplomatic immunity. So let's look at this case, ladies and gentlemen. Let's conclude by asking ourselves that critical question again. Is it right to jeopardize years of international diplomacy, years of international relationships, the progress between countries like North and South Korea, for example, or even the ability of nations like Iran and the UK to talk to each other, even after Iran seized British soldiers in the Gulf? Okay, it's because of diplomats, it's because of diplomatic immunity that these things are even possible. And all they say is that some diplomats are bad people. That's the reason why they want to remove diplomatic immunity. We don't think that's enough. And we think clearly the harm of their plan is going to be so great when we can still achieve the benefits they would like to achieve with our model of supporting diplomatic immunity. And that's why we, et cetera, et cetera. So you understand how this thing works? Okay, it doesn't matter. You can give me any motion. I'll be able to do that in a reply speech because I'll just focus on the key aspects. And then I can clearly, I can pretty much extrapolate how things work from there. Now, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be handing out these things to you. Take one. Okay? And you'll see on the last page of this handout, there is a sample flow sheet of a debate. Okay? The debate is, this House believes that television has negative effects on society. Okay? Or has a negative effect on society, pardon me, not negative effects, to make it slightly clear. So this particular flow sheet is going to be helpful to you later on when we do our exercises on reply speeches, because this is the debate you have to reply to. Okay? I've only done the flow sheet up until the third speaker, obviously. So before this, there are a few pages actually of the actual debate. So the 4 pages previous to that, there was a problem with the printer, so sorry for the slight smudging. But you have an outline of all of the arguments and all of the things that happened during that debate. Okay? So this will enable you to come up with reply speeches. So you're supposed to do this during the actual exercise. But let me go back to the flow sheet and then talk to you a little bit about note-taking and how to do effective reply speeches.
Yes.
Yes.
It's
all the same. I just said it. There's a problem with the printer. Okay? Sorry about that. Let's go back to that flow sheet. how do you give an effective reply speech exactly? I mean, now that this is, again, it's just a sample, but how do you give this kind of a reply speech from this kind of a flow sheet? Well, the first thing is this. You need a flow sheet. Let me stress that again. You need a flow sheet. You need to actually write things down. Now, I've seen some debaters not write anything down and then come up, or basically just write their speech. They don't write down what happened in the debate. They write a speech for their reply speech. That's not going to work. You can't assume that the reply is going to be exactly the way you envision it. You can't tune out what the other side is saying and then just come up with your own reply regardless of what they present in the debate. The reply is a reply to the debate. So it's necessary to come up with very detailed notes throughout the debate of what actually happened. And whomever is doing this, the first or second speaker, I kid you not, you have to write every argument that was mentioned in the debate. Every single one. You can't miss one. Okay? If you miss one, ask your teammate, what did that person say? What was their split? What is their third argument? Because if you don't write things down, how is it possible for you to come up and give an overview or a synopsis of what happened in the debate? How will you really fully see the debate and explain the key issues in the debate? What if the argument you missed was the key issue in the debate for their side? What if you somehow don't deal with that in the reply speech? Do you think that's going to be impressive to the judge? So here's a suggested way of doing it. Okay, you'll see in this flow sheet how each speaker has arguments that were written down. Basically, these are the things that were mentioned by that speaker. Okay, follow me so far. All right. Secondly, you'll see arrows. The thick arrows pointing to the particular argument previously, these are the arrows where people are rebutting, where they are dealing with arguments. They are stopping the flow of this argument from going all the way through because they think these are critical arguments and we have to stop it at this point. Now, why is it important to write down when you stop things and what you said when you stopped it? Because, again, you can't give a snapshot of a debate if you don't know how you dealt with certain things. In fact, that's one of the components of strategy. James has a really good definition of strategy, which is basically your ability to adapt to the changes in the debate, the things that work all the way through. What changed? What was new? What did you not expect? If there was something unexpected, how did you deal with that? Okay? Those kinds of things. That's really good strategy. If you can deal with the changes in the debate or the unexpected things or even the expected things, but if you deal with them well, then you have good strategy. This will help. And then you see other arrows. Okay? Do you see the arrows with like the jagged arrows, those that aren't actually solid, they go all the way to the right, for instance. Those are arrows where the arguments are trying to be, they're being reestablished. Or they go all the way through. If you see the ones with the boxes under the third affirmative and the second negative, those are arguments that go through. Nobody rebutted those, so they go all the way through. Okay? So you'll see there are different ways of doing this. You can come up with your own system for note-taking, your own symbolism. These are just my symbols. Okay? They just help me understand. So when I look at this, I know exactly what happened in the debate. A reply speaker has to have something like this. The reply speaker has to know what arguments went through, or what arguments were dealt with, or when they did particular things, or what exactly was said about a particular issue, or what critical example might have been mentioned, right? Those kinds of things. Even the definition, that has to be put up there. Because those things count, and those things could matter in the actual reply. Now, you're wondering, wait a minute, but the reply speech is only 4 minutes. Why do I have to write down everything that happened in the debate? Well, this is why reply speakers have a difficult job. You have to know everything that happened, but you have to prioritize which things you would like to focus on. Because the key things in the reply speech, there are 3 key things in the reply speech. I'm going to write them down on the board because I want to emphasize them. You should strive for each of these 3 things. You should strive for clarity. You should be able to clearly express the issues in the debate, to clearly point out your point of view, to clearly mention the central issue, to clearly establish why your side won. If it's confused, if it's not something that is easy to follow, the judges are going to have a hard time. You're going to have a hard time. Okay? The second thing is focus. This is probably the most critical thing that a person needs in the reply speech. What do you talk about? What do you not talk about? And choosing what to talk about and what not to talk about can really win you or lose you a debate. For example, there was a debate in the octofinals this year between Pakistan and Korea, okay, which sadly my team lost. But it was a 2-1 split. And one judge decided for Korea because the judge felt we proved a lot of different things. We said all these things out. We were propositioned, okay? The motion was this House would, I think something like, yeah, would force companies to hire more women for senior management positions, something like that. And so while one judge, the judge that voted for us said, you know, you won because you proved a lot of things that you said you would prove. The 2 judges that gave it to the other side, and I'm not questioning the decision, I feel it was a fair decision, said, the biggest problem with you was you never dealt with a critical argument of the opposition, which was the resentment that people will feel towards women. That you don't actually gain respect anymore, because once people think that a woman has achieved a senior management position because of a particular law, all women in senior management positions will suddenly be questioned. And the respect that women deserve will be long in coming, because society will start to feel that they actually don't deserve those positions, that they're only there because of that particular law. And we kind of let that go through until the reply speech, which was a little bit too late. Okay? So it's important to pick out the critical things and deal with them as they come, because otherwise you could lose the whole debate. And we didn't focus enough on that particular argument. Yes, we actually did mention that in reply speech, but at that point, it was just not enough. And what happens if you don't deal with that in reply speech? What happens if a critical argument like that goes through and you never express it, you never explain it? Then that could be the reason why you lose the debate. Some judges will just pick up on that. Yes, Vera? You just wanted to raise your hand, exercising. Okay, does anyone have any specific questions right now before I continue? Yes, Helen.
What do you think is the best method to, like you have like the general idea of how to format it, but what do you think is the best way to go about, you know, dealing with the key issues? Do you ask a question? Do you just bring it up?
Okay, let me give you how these things are formulated. And I did, sorry, there was something I should have added, which I promised to add, talking about a comparison between the third speech, which I'll do right after I answer Helen's question, okay? You can establish a key point by giving statements, like the key point is this, 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 and this is how we dealt with it, and this is how they didn't deal with it, etc., etc. Or you can ask questions, for example. Like, there are 3 questions outstanding in this debate, and we cannot decide the winner until we answer these 3 questions. First question is, okay, what is the purpose of diplomatic immunity? Why was it founded? What is it supposedly for? The second question is, how is it practically applied in the world today? Is it done fairly or unfairly, for example? And the third question is the world going to be a better place if we remove diplomatic immunity and all the associated benefits that you get from diplomatic immunity? So we're going to answer these 3 questions and show you how the proposition side won this debate. Okay, that's an example. So you can do that too. All right? It really depends. Your style is question-oriented, I notice, and that's fine, as long as you deal with the key points. Okay? Yeah, yes, then.
Just one question on that part. I used to have questions like that,
yes.
But I got a lot of feedback that they're too broad. In the question there is a specific example of an argument.
Yes, yes.
Is that okay?
Questions, they don't have to be so specific. Like, the first question in this debate is, what is the address of the British diplomat in Iran? And what is his mobile phone number? That's too specific. Okay? I mean, you can ask broad questions, but I think what they probably meant was you didn't focus on the answers enough, or the questions were so broad that no specific answer could be construed from it. Like, the question in this debate today about diplomatic immunity is, okay, what is immunity? And is immunity okay? Now, that's a little different from diplomatic immunity. Okay? It's a bit broader, like the concept of immunity, even things like pardoning, like Nixon was pardoned, he never had to go to prison. Okay, Gerald Ford pardoned him, etc., etc. I mean, is that exactly what this debate is about? Just immunity or diplomatic immunity, which is a little bit different. There's a specific focus there. It's a protection, or it's a means to guarantee that people can communicate without reprisals. Okay, those kinds of things. You know what? In the 1960s, we almost had nuclear war. And when John F. Kennedy was really upset that the Russians were shipping missiles, nuclear missiles to Cuba, okay, there were like threats, embargoes, all these kinds of things. Do you honestly think Nikita Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy or Adlai Stevenson, for example, at that point, could have communicated in the United Nations without a sense of diplomatic immunity? Okay, those kinds of things were vital or absolutely necessary for us to prevent these kinds of conflicts. Or even when there is a conflict, one of the things about the United Nations is this: when nations have certain conflicts, like England had with Argentina in the Falklands War in the 1980s, they still could meet in the United Nations. They were at war, but their diplomatic representatives could still talk to each other and hopefully work out a peaceful solution, which eventually happened. Right? So those things, you know, basically those kinds of questions, focus it a little bit more. I agree, if it's too broad, like immunity itself, without focusing on the diplomatic part, then yeah, you might kind of like be led astray. Okay? But don't be so specific that you only focus on one aspect and one example. You do have to be sufficiently broad that you give a general overall picture, but not so broad that you don't focus them on the key things you want them to focus on. All right, any other questions before I continue? All right, now, the difference between this thing and the third speaker's speech, and if you remember the third speaker's organization pattern, it looks very similar, right? The difference is this: the third speaker has to rebut everything. The third speaker has to rebut all of the arguments presented in the debate. All the arguments and all the counter rebuttals, or the rebuttals, sorry, and the counter rebuttals. Everything has to be dealt with by the third speaker. Now, note, I used the word arguments. I didn't say examples. Because sometimes what speakers do is they focus on maybe 3, 4 examples in the entire debate for their side, but they give, let's say, 22 different examples. Do you need to deal with all 5 examples of one argument? Why not?
If you disprove one, you disprove.
Okay, so let's look at diplomatic immunity, right? Because this was our sample today. If you talk about diplomatic immunity and how it was necessary and how it helped to end the Falklands conflict, for example, and you focus on diplomatic immunity and how it enabled Nixon to go to China in the 1970s and promote détente, you know, those things. Or if you focus on diplomatic immunity and how Castro or Ahmadinejad or all these other people can suddenly still go to New York and the United Nations, do you have to deal with every single example?
No, you deal with the essence of the argument.
The essence of the argument. You might want to talk about one example just to highlight it, just to show how it doesn't necessarily work, but you don't have to deal with all 22 different arguments if 22 were given. But the third speaker must deal with every argument. Okay? There are 3 general things that the third speakers do. Okay? The first is you got to rebut the arguments of the opposing side. They are constructive arguments. Okay? The second thing is you have to defend your original arguments from the rebuttals of the other side. So you basically rebut the rebuttals. All right? And the third thing is you have to show that in comparison your team wins the debate. That's what the third speaker does. Okay, how in totality, because of all the reputations, all these things, their position doesn't work and your side works. And so if you're in proposition, the motion will stand, or if you're in opposition, the motion will fall. That's why it sounds similar to the reply speaker, because both of them are saying that you win. But they're doing very different things. The third speaker rebuts everything, including the refutations on the refutations or whatever. Okay, so if there was a rebuttal, you deal with the rebuttal. If there was a rebuttal to your rebuttal, you destroy the rebuttal to your rebuttal so your original rebuttal stands. Okay, all these kinds of things. That has to be done in the third speech. The reply speaker focuses. The reply speaker only deals with the most critical or key points in the debate. And sometimes the reply speaker, as I said, they won't necessarily even mention a specific argument. They'll mention a specific event, like a definitional challenge thing, for instance, and how that thing works or didn't work. Okay. Those kinds of things. Or somebody mentioning a counter proposal in the third speech, and how that's clearly unfair, and obviously you can't be expected to deal with that, and so therefore, even if they had come up, their development just wasn't good enough, they didn't really prove it. Those kinds of things, you can mention those things in the reply speech, because there are key events throughout the debate, okay? Or if they had a team slide, if they had the second speaker develop more than was actually promised, or if there was a hung case, or any of those other things, you don't have to be like, tell the judge everything. This is another thing you shouldn't do. You shouldn't tell the judge, okay judge, the third speaker was overtime by 23 seconds. So you should deduct marks by, you know, judges don't appreciate that, okay? They judge, you just tell people what happened. But it's okay for you to say, look, it wasn't fair of them to mention a counter proposal in the third opposition speech, okay? Because clearly that didn't give us enough time to deal with that. But having said so, you know, obviously it wasn't good enough, they didn't prove it, blah, 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 blah. You can do things like that. You don't have to act like you're the mother of the judge telling the judge how to judge, okay? They don't like that at all. Okay. The last thing is emphasis. Okay? This is why you have to focus. You need to emphasize the major things. You need to show people your side won because of these specific points that you mentioned. The third speaker, like I said, will not be able to emphasize any one point so greatly because the third speaker has to deal with all of the rebuttals that have to be dealt with in the debate. I mean, you can emphasize key points even in the third speech, of course, but it just doesn't come out with that kind of clarity and focus and emphasis that the reply speaker is able to afford. I'll give you an example. Semifinals of the Asian Championships, okay? First Asian Championships. I was debating, and based on the judges' scorecards, we had lost the debate after the third speech. Okay? We were losing that debate. So now it was up to the reply speech. And if I didn't do a decent reply speech, we would lose, we would never have an opportunity to win the Asian Championships. But here's the debate. The debate was, this House believes in a united, this House believes that united we stand, divided we fall. That was the motion. It was pretty open. We in proposition had defined it as, we are promoting regional diplomatic unions like a united Asia, similar to the United Nations. We think that this is something that's useful, we think this is something that's necessary because otherwise there'll be too much tension in Asia, and this is something that we really, really need. The entire opposition case was centered on, this isn't possible. How can you get Pakistan and India to even agree with each other on anything? How can you get China to even recognize Tibet's right to be in that union? How can you get Taiwan in? You know, those kinds of things. They were focusing on all of the problems in Asia. And the reason they won that debate after the third constructive was the judges bought all of these things, and they said it was really, really difficult, all these, you know, pretty much it was just impractical seeming. And so in my reply speech, I had to establish a focus. I had to establish the premise, the central issue, okay, which is this. We are not saying that we can solve every conflict. That's not the point we have to say. The point is this, that if there is conflict, is it not right to try to solve them? And what we said was, the fact that every argument they gave was about how conflicts exist actually helps our side. I said, how can you possibly expect Pakistan and India to talk to each other without this kind of diplomatic immunity, without this kind of body that gives them the opportunity to discuss things? Okay, and then they say, well, what about the United Nations? They didn't actually say that, by the way. We had a problematic case, I know that. But they never mentioned the United Nations. They just attacked us on the fact that there were conflicts in Asia. So we did them. Exactly, that's the reason for this. That establishes the purpose for our policy. And you never once showed that diplomacy is so harmful. You just showed that there were conflicts. And our position is about diplomacy. Okay, and the judge said, okay, they kind of bought that, and they gave us that debate because of the reply speech. They said it was close. They were leading by about a point or something after the constructives. But then apparently my reply speech was 1.5 points better than their reply speech. And so we won by half a mark. That's so important. If you can focus it, if you can convince the judge somehow, yeah, this is the way to look at it. That's exactly the key thing. That's what we need to talk about. Then the judge will pretty much, give it to you. I even started that, just to express how I did that. I started that speech this way. I said, when I was 8 years old, I had a best friend, a guy named Julius. He and I were good pals. It just so happened one day, I don't know, this happens with kids. We started fighting. And we didn't really know why. But punches started flying. And we started rolling on the ground. Blood was spilled, literally, during that fight. And by the end of that fight, both of us were absolutely convinced that we hated each other and we never wanted to be friends again. Now what happened? A teacher saw us fighting and dragged both of us to the principal's office. And the principal forced us to explain to him, without shouting, without throwing punches, what exactly happened. And in the process of explaining what happened, we both realized that it was a really stupid thing to be fighting about. And we left that office battered, bruised, and bloody, but still friends. Now the point of this, ladies and gentlemen, is that you have a continent that does have conflicts, and everything they've said in this debate proves that. Yes, you have a conflict between India and Pakistan. Yes, you have a conflict with certain countries in other parts, even in the Middle East. Yes, you have conflicts. But that's not the issue. The issue in this debate is this. When people fight, do you leave them to fight, or do you attempt to bring them together in peace? And that's everything that we talked about. And that's why we made a proposal. Okay? That's an example. That's how I started my reply speech. Do you see what I'm talking about? Focusing, all these other things. So if you can get the judge to go, yeah, that's right. The fact that there is conflict means that there's actually a need to bring people together. That's why we have to have this organization. And yes, so we won by half a mark. That's why reply speeches are critical. Any questions? You have a goofy grin. What's up? No questions? Okay, so let me just wrap things up by, again, focusing on the notes I gave you. Okay? So you understand what we're going to be doing later on in our activity. So the outline outlines a particular debate. As I said, this House believes that television has a negative effect on society. Okay? So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be asking you to read through the arguments as if this really happened in the debate. As if these things were actually said. And depending on whether you're proposition or opposition, we'll break you up a little bit. I want you to give reply speeches. Each of you will be attempting to give a reply speech as if you had watched this debate. And like I said, the visual flow sheet should help you. Okay? This should help you prioritize which arguments you really want to focus on. This should help you give a general, perspective or overview of what the debate is all about. And you can develop your central issue, you can talk about the key points, you can show how one side's clash was better than the other side's clash, etc., etc. Okay? That's what we need to do. So in conclusion, I want you to remember, reply speeches seem like they're half as important as any speech, but reply speeches are still part of the debate. So it's still your job to fight for every point, so to speak. You need to focus. You need to write everything down. You as a team have to establish for yourself, before the reply speaker stands up, what are the critical issues, what you should or shouldn't focus on. Don't leave the reply speaker alone. Don't just say, okay, you're doing reply, we're just going to fall asleep or start doodling in our notebooks. Okay, that's not good enough. The team makes a decision about what the focus is all about. The team makes a decision about what needs to be emphasized and what the key points are. One person executes the plan, of course. But that reply speaker shouldn't go against what the team wants. So it is a team thing. The reply speech is the sum total of everything that your whole team did in that debate. And it is vital that you contribute to that speech as a team by deciding what must or must not be included in that particular speech. And if you do it well enough, and you really, really have a nice memorable ending, for example, you could sway a judge, or make the margin close enough that you give yourself a chance in the future, or increase the margin of victory, if you will, so you give yourself better chances in the future. That's why reply speeches are so important. Are there any final questions? Okay, thanks very much. Appreciate it. We're now going to go into exercise.